We're ready to dive into something really interesting. Today we're tackling consciousness, going deep into how your brain creates the experience of, well, being you. Using this research paper called self185201.pdf. Really fascinating stuff.
It really is. We're going way beyond basic textbook knowledge here. This research really digs into the experience of consciousness.
Okay, so let's say I'm trying to picture consciousness. Am I picturing like a little me inside my head making decisions?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's tempting to think of it like a little CEO in our brains.
Right, calling the shots.
But if you think about it, if that were true, damaging a specific part of the brain, it should like really mess with consciousness.
Yeah.
This research uses the example of the insular cortex damage to both sides, and people still feel like themselves. Makes sense.
So it's not like a specific spot where consciousness lives.
It's not that simple. It's more like a team effort, different brain regions working together. Like an orchestra.
Okay, I'm getting that.
All the different parts have to work together to create this, unified sound.
And for consciousness, what's the first chair?
Right.
What kicks things off?
You might be surprised. It actually starts with a part of the brain we don't usually think about as a star performer, the brainstem.
Really?
Yeah. We tend to focus on the cerebral cortex, but...
Because that's the more evolved part?
Yeah. But the brainstem is crucial. I mean, without it, no consciousness because, well, no being alive.
Right, it's handling all the essentials. Breathing, heartbeat.
Exactly. Like setting the stage, making sure everything's running. But, and here's where it gets really interesting for us humans, the brainstem also contributes to what the research calls the proto-self. Basically, the foundation for our sense of self.
So even without all the complex thinking our cortex does, that primal part of our brain is already figuring out that we are a thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. But then the question becomes, how does this ancient structure, the brainstem, actually communicate with the more evolved parts of our brain, like the cerebral cortex?
Yeah, how do those two very different parts of ourselves even connect?
And that's where the thalamus comes in.
Okay.
Think of it like a relay station between the brainstem and the cerebral cortex.
So all the information going in and out.
Exactly. The thalamus takes in sensory information and then sends it to the right part of the cortex for processing.
Like a central hub directing traffic.
Exactly. And the thalamus is pretty amazing at this job. It doesn't just relay information, it weaves it all together.
Creating our experience of consciousness.
Yeah. The thalamus makes sure we experience the world as a whole, not just, a bunch of random sights and sounds.
So we've got the brainstem doing its thing, the thalamus connecting everything, and then there's the cerebral cortex. What's its role in all of this? So we've got this ancient structure, the brainstem laying the groundwork, the thalamus acting as this grand central station, and then the cerebral cortex receiving all that information. But there's still this big question of how all of that actually translates into the feeling of being conscious.
Right. It's like we can map out the brain's activity, but why does it feel like anything at all?
Exactly.
This is where things get really tricky. We're entering the realm of what's called qualia.
Qualia. I feel like I've heard that word before, but...
It's a tough one. Even neuroscientists are still trying to fully wrap their heads around it. This research breaks qualia down into two main problems. So qualia I is about the feeling that comes with any experience.
Okay, so like, if I'm looking at a beautiful sunset, it's not just the colors my brain is processing, right? There's a feeling I get from it.
Exactly. And that feeling, whether it's awe, wonder, just like simple pleasure, that's qualia I. It's like there's this emotional background music playing along with our awareness.
Interesting. So if qualia I is the feeling, what's qualia tet?
That's the even bigger question. Qualia 2 is about why we experience those feelings at all. Why aren't we just, robots reacting to things but not really feeling them?
It's like it's not just that I feel something while watching the sunset. It's the why behind feeling anything in the first place.
Yeah, and that's a question that's puzzled people for centuries. This research points to some possibilities, though. Remember those primal feelings from the brainstem we talked about earlier?
The ones tied to our basic bodily functions.
Those. The research suggests that those basic feelings might be the foundation for all feeling.
Interesting.
Like the brainstem is always getting information from the body, right? It has to keep everything running smoothly.
So it's not just taking in information, it's actively responding, making adjustments.
Right. And the research argues that over time, the neurons in the brainstem, especially those dealing with these internal signals, they become so connected to the body's processes that they're almost like inseparable.
So the activity of those neurons starts to become a feeling.
That's the idea. It's not just data anymore. It's felt experience.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get that.
Yeah.
But how do we go from those basic feelings to the more complex emotions we experience?
That's where things get even more fascinating. Think about how much of our world comes through our senses. Sight, sound, touch, all of it.
We take our senses for granted, but they're pretty amazing when you think about it.
And they're not just passively taking in information, they're actively engaging with the world.
It's like when you walk into a bakery. It's not just the smell of bread hitting your nose. You might lean in, take a deep breath, really try to experience it.
Exactly. And all those tiny movements, those adjustments, they create feedback that gets sent back to the brain, adding to the sensory experience. And those feelings we talked about, the emotional responses, they get mixed in too.
So it's like the brain is creating this multi-dimensional map of the experience.
Yeah.
It's combining the sensory information with the feeling of our bodies interacting with the world, and then adding our emotional responses on top of that.
You got it. It's this amazing symphony of activity going on. And here's where it gets really wild. This research even suggests that individual neurons might have some basic form of feeling.
Wait, you're saying that our individual cells might be capable of feeling something?
It's a radical idea, but think about it. Neurons are living cells, right? Even single-celled organisms react to their environment.
Like how a plant grows towards sunlight.
Exactly. Now imagine that scaled up to billions of neurons, each responding in their own way. And you can start to see how this incredible complexity could give rise to the feeling of consciousness.
So we've gone from the ancient parts of the brain to the possibility of feeling at the cellular level.
And we're not done yet.
It's amazing to think that after exploring the deepest parts of our brains, we end up wondering about the future of consciousness itself. How does technology even fit into all of this?
Right. I mean, it's a huge part of our lives. We're spending all this time in the digital world, and it's got to be having some effect.
Well, the research mentioned this anatomical bottleneck thing again, that mismatch between the brainstem and the cortex. How does that connect to our digital lives?
Well, we talked about how the brainstem is really tuned into our bodies, right? Keeping everything running.
Right.
But when we're online, it's almost like we're disconnected from our physical selves.
Yeah, it's like we're overloading our brains with all this information. But those, like, really deep primal experiences are getting left behind.
Exactly. And our brains are constantly rewiring themselves based on our experiences' neuroplasticity, remember?
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, is all this tech changing our brains, even at that deep level of the brainstem and cortex?
It's like we're becoming more digitally adapted. Maybe even if it means losing some of that connection to our physical selves.
It's a fascinating idea, right? And some neuroscientists are definitely concerned. Think about it. Our ancestors relied on their senses to survive. They were so present in their bodies, way more than we are now with all our distractions.
It's true. It's like the way we experience the world now is just fundamentally different.
Yeah. And it's happening so fast. Imagine trying to explain to someone 1,000 years ago what it feels like to scroll through social media.
They wouldn't even understand what we were talking about.
Right, and yet our brains are handling it. But it's important to remember, we're talking about subtle changes here. It's not like our brains are going to suddenly turn into computers.
Right. It's more like tech is adding something new to how our consciousness works, something that might stick around for generations.
Exactly. It's like we're part of this massive experiment, and we don't even know the results yet.
This whole deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've gone from the oldest parts of the brain to the mystery of feeling, and now we're thinking about the future of consciousness itself. My brain is definitely feeling a little bit more, well, conscious after all that.
I hear you. And for everyone listening, remember, the real point isn't to find all the answers right now. It's about asking the questions, about being curious about this amazing thing we call consciousness. Who knows what we'll discover next?